The locket was half buried in the red Arizona dust when Cole Danver's boot nearly crushed it, and something about the way the late afternoon sun caught its tarnished gold surface made him stop dead in his tracks, as though the earth itself had reached up and grabbed him by the ankle. He crouched down in the middle of the sun-beaten road just outside the town of Redemption, Arizona, in the summer of 1882, and he picked up the small oval locket with two calloused fingers. It was delicate, the kind of thing a woman treasures with a ferocity that has nothing to do with its monetary value. The chain was broken, snapped clean, and the locket itself was etched with a pattern of climbing roses along its edges. He rubbed the dust away with his thumb and felt the weight of it, surprisingly heavy for something so small, as though it carried more than just metal and whatever was sealed inside. Cole Danver was 28 years old and had been riding the territory since he was 16, when his father's cattle ranch outside of Tucson had burned to the ground during a drought-sparked wildfire that had taken everything, including his father. He was not a man who lingered on sentiment. He had learned early that the Arizona territory had no patience for grief, that the sun would rise indifferently over whatever tragedy a man had suffered the night before, and that the desert required your full attention at all times, or it would kill you quietly and without apology. But he stood there in the dusty road with that little locket in his palm, and he did not move for a long moment. The town of Redemption stretched out before him, a collection of weathered timber-framed buildings that hugged both sides of a main road wide enough for two wagons to pass each other. There was a general store, a livery stable, a telegraph office, a saloon called the Sulphur Spur, a modest church at the far end of the road, and perhaps a dozen other establishments that provided the basic necessities of frontier life. The Santa Cruz River was less than a mile to the east, which was why this particular stretch of southern Arizona had managed to support a permanent settlement at all. Water was the lifeblood of everything out here, and the towns that had it survived, and the towns that did not became ghost towns with alarming speed. Cole slipped the locket into his shirt pocket and continued walking, leading his horse, a bay gelding named Scratch, toward the livery stable. He had been on the road for 3 weeks, having ridden up from the Mexican border region where he had been helping a small cattle operation move their herd north before the summer heat made the journey impossible. The work was done, he had been paid, and now he had a few dollars in his pocket and no particular destination in mind, which was more or less the permanent condition of his life. He paid the liveryman, a heavy-set fellow named Burl with a magnificent red mustache, to stable Scratch for the night, and he walked down the main road of Redemption with the slow, unhurried gait of a man who has spent so many years on horseback that walking on flat ground feels slightly strange. The Sulphur Spur was loud with the early evening crowd when he pushed through the batwing doors. The piano player in the corner was working through a lively rendition of something Cole did not recognize, and the smell of tobacco smoke and whiskey and sawdust settled over him like a familiar blanket. He found a spot at the bar and ordered a whiskey and a plate of whatever the kitchen had, which turned out to be beef stew and cornbread, and he ate slowly and watched the room with the quiet attention of a man accustomed to reading unfamiliar territory. It was the bartender, a lean fellow named Pete who had the rapid-fire speech patterns of a man who processed information about the town as efficiently as he poured drinks, who told Cole about the woman who had come through on the afternoon stage. "Caused quite a commotion," Pete said, wiping a glass with a rag that was probably not doing much good. "Stage driver said she was crying before they even hit the town limits. Lost something on the road, apparently. Some piece of jewelry. She was in here not an hour ago asking if anyone had turned anything in. Real upset about it." Cole reached into his shirt pocket and set the locket on the bar between them. Pete leaned forward and squinted at it. "Well, I'll be. Where is she now?" Cole asked. "Took a room at Mrs. Houghton's boarding house, the blue one at the north end just past the telegraph office. Can't miss it. Mrs. Houghton plants marigolds along the front fence every year like clockwork. Cole wrapped his hand around the locket and picked up his glass. He finished his whiskey, paid Pete for the meal and the drink, and walked back out into the warm Arizona evening. The marigolds along Mrs. Houghton's fence were bright orange gold in the last light of the sun, and the boarding house behind them was indeed painted a faded blue that had once been quite proud of itself. Cole knocked on the front door, and a small, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s appeared almost instantly, as though she had been standing just on the other side waiting for exactly this. "Evening, ma'am," Cole said, removing his hat. "I'm looking for a woman who came in on the afternoon stage. I believe I may have found something she lost on the road." Mrs. Houghton's expression shifted from cautious to curious. She stepped back and opened the door wider. "That would be Miss Clara Ashford. She is in the sitting room." "Come in, but mind your boots." Cole wiped his boots on the mat with the thoroughness of a man raised with manners, however rough his circumstances had since become, and followed Mrs. Houghton down a short hallway that smelled pleasantly of beeswax and dried lavender. The sitting room was small and neat, with a braided rug and two upholstered chairs flanking a cold fireplace, and a writing desk beneath the window where the last pink light of the evening was still visible. Seated in one of the chairs, her hands folded in her lap with the rigid stillness of someone who has recently been crying and is holding themselves together through sheer force of will, was the woman Cole would later understand had rearranged everything he thought he knew about his life. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark brown hair that had been pinned up but had come partially loose during whatever difficult journey she had been on, so that soft strands curved against her temples and the back of her neck. Her eyes, when she looked up at him, were a shade of gray-green that reminded him simultaneously of sagebrush after rain and of deep river water in shadow, and they were still red-rimmed from crying, which somehow made them more remarkable rather than less. She was wearing a traveling dress of dark green wool that was dusty from the road, and there was a smudge of Arizona red earth on her left cheekbone that she did not appear to be aware of. She was, in the plainest terms Cole could find when he searched for them later, the most quietly beautiful woman he had ever been in the same room with. "Miss Ashford," Mrs. Houghton said from the doorway. "This gentleman says he may have found your lost item." Clara Ashford stood up from the chair in a single movement, and her hands came together in front of her chest in a gesture that was almost prayer-like. "You found it." Her voice was low and had a slight tremor in it that she was clearly trying to control. "Is it a locket? Gold with roses engraved on the front?" Cole reached into his pocket and held it out to her. She crossed the small room in 3 steps and took it from his palm, and the moment her fingers closed around it, she made a small sound that was not quite a word, a sharp exhale of breath that carried an enormous amount of emotion compressed into something very small. She turned away from him, which he understood instinctively was not rudeness but the opposite, a kind of privacy she needed for whatever was about to happen. She opened the locket, and she burst into tears, not the quiet, controlled kind of crying she had probably been doing all afternoon, but the sudden, full, helpless kind that comes when grief and relief arrive at exactly the same moment and overwhelm every defense a person has constructed. Her shoulders shook. One hand came up to cover her mouth. The other hand held the locket so tightly that Cole could see the tendons in her wrist. Mrs. Houghton made a soft sound of sympathy from the doorway. Cole stood very still in the middle of the sitting room with his hat in his hands and did not say anything, because he understood instinctively that there was nothing useful to say, and that sometimes the most respectful thing a person can do is simply remain present and let someone else's grief take up the full space it requires. After a long moment, Clara Ashford turned back around. Her cheeks were wet and her eyes were bright with tears, but she was pulling herself back together with a visible effort that he found quietly remarkable. She looked at him directly, which he also found remarkable, because most people looked away when they had been seen crying. "I am sorry," she said. "You must think me terribly undone." "No, ma'am," Cole said honestly. "I think you lost something important and you are relieved to have it back. That seems reasonable to me." She looked at him for a moment as though she was deciding whether he was sincere, and apparently she concluded that he was, because the rigid line of her shoulders softened fractionally. "My mother gave it to me," she said, and then stopped, as though she had run directly into a wall of emotion and needed a moment to find her way around it. "She passed 2 years ago. There is a photograph inside. It is the only one I have of her." Cole nodded slowly. He understood loss. He had carried his father's watch for 12 years in his own shirt pocket. The glass cracked, the movement long since stopped, because he could not bring himself to be without it. "I understand," he said, and he meant it in a way that she must have heard because she looked at him with an expression that shifted slightly, some subtle recalibration happening behind her gray-green eyes. "May I ask where you found it?" she said. "In the road about a quarter-mile before the town line. The chain was already broken." "Must have fallen when the stage went over a rut." She nodded. "I felt it go. I reached for it and it was gone before the stage even stopped. I thought I would never see it again." She paused. "Thank you. I don't know how to properly thank you. You could not have known whose it was." "I knew it mattered to someone," Cole said simply. "That was enough." Mrs. Houghton cleared her throat gently from the doorway. "Miss Ashford, I'll bring you some tea. And sir," she addressed Cole with the particular tone of a woman who runs an orderly establishment, "are you in need of a room for the evening? I do have one available, though my rates are firm." Cole considered. He had planned to make camp outside of town, which would have been cheaper. But there was something about the sitting room and the marigolds out front, and the way the evening light was fading outside the window that made him say yes. He was given a room on the second floor, small and clean with a view of the back garden. He lay on the narrow bed that night and looked at the ceiling and thought about the way Clara Ashford had turned away from him to open the locket, and the way she had turned back around with her eyes full of tears and had looked at him directly anyway. He thought about her voice, low and slightly unsteady, and about the smudge of red earth on her cheekbone that no one had told her about. He got up early the next morning, as was his habit, and went downstairs to find that Mrs. Houghton served breakfast at 7 o'clock sharp in the small dining room that was connected to the sitting room. There were 2 other boarders, a traveling seed merchant named Abernathy and a young schoolteacher named Davidson, who had recently arrived to take up a position at the small school on the edge of town. Neither of them was Clara Ashford, and Cole found himself paying more attention to the doorway than to his oatmeal. She came in at 7:05, and Mrs. Houghton made a small, pointed sound about punctuality that Clara accepted with a grace that suggested she was accustomed to navigating difficult social situations. She was dressed in a pale blue dress today, and her hair was properly pinned, and the smudge of red earth was gone from her cheek, and she looked rested in the way that a person looks rested when they have finally, after considerable difficulty, been able to sleep. She saw Cole at the table and stopped for the briefest moment, and then she sat down across from him and said, "Good morning, mister," and realized she did not know his name. "Danver," he said. "Cole Danver. Mr. Danver, I hope you slept well." "Well enough, you." "Better than I have in several nights," she admitted, and he understood that she meant the return of the locket had allowed her to rest in a way that its absence had not. "I am Clara Ashford." "I know. Mrs. Houghton told me your name last night." "And she told me yours this morning," Clara said, with a small smile that was the first smile he had seen on her face, and that did something complicated to his chest. "Small towns are efficient that way." "That they are," Cole agreed. Abernathy the seed merchant launched into a detailed account of his journey from Tucson and the state of the roads, which neither Cole nor Clara had asked for, but which filled the silence in a way that was ultimately useful, because it gave them both something to not be looking at while they were actually looking at each other. After breakfast, Cole went to check on Scratch at the livery, and when he came back up the main road, he passed Clara Ashford coming out of the general store with a small parcel under her arm. He stopped and they looked at each other with the slightly awkward recognition of two people who have already had an unexpectedly intimate interaction and are now trying to navigate the ordinary world again. "Do you stay long in Redemption?" she asked. "I hadn't planned to," he said. "You?" "I am waiting for a letter," she said, and there was something careful in how she said it, something measured, as though the letter represented a decision she had not yet fully resolved. "It should arrive within the week." "I came from Prescott." "Long way," he said. Prescott was the territorial capital, a good 2 days' journey north. "Yes," she agreed. She shifted the parcel under her arm. "It is a long way from home, actually. I grew up in Missouri. I came to Arizona 8 months ago to work as a seamstress in Prescott, but the work has been—" She paused, and something moved across her face, a shadow of something that might have been disappointment or might have been something more complicated. "The work has been less steady than I was promised." Cole nodded. He knew that story. The territory was full of people who had arrived with reasonable expectations and found that reality operated according to its own set of rules. "And the letter?" he asked, which was perhaps a more forward question than was entirely polite, but she had opened the subject and he was genuinely curious. "A position," she said. "I applied for a position as a seamstress and housekeeper at a ranch outside of Tombstone. The owner wrote to me in Prescott and I agreed in principle, but there were details to be worked out. The final letter should be here soon." "Tombstone's a rough town," Cole said. "I am aware," she said, with a steadiness that told him she was not a woman who appreciated being warned about things she had already considered. "But the position is at a ranch, not in the town itself. And I am not, despite last night's evidence to the contrary, a fragile person." He believed her completely. "I didn't say you were," he said. She looked at him for a moment with those gray-green eyes, and then the corner of her mouth curved upward again, and she said, "No, you didn't. I apologize. I have been managing people's concerns about my travel plans for months, and I sometimes get ahead of myself." "No apology needed," Cole said. "I was just stating a fact about the town, not passing judgment on your decision." They stood there on the main road of Redemption for a moment, with the mid-morning sun already fierce overhead and the dust raising in little spirals where the wind caught it, and neither of them moved to leave. "Do you know the area around Tombstone?" she asked finally. "Reasonably well," he said. "I've worked cattle through the San Pedro Valley a few times." "Then perhaps," she said, with a formality that he recognized as her way of organizing a thought that felt slightly larger than she wanted to admit, "you might tell me something about it over supper. Mrs. Houghton runs a proper table, and I understand there is no particular rule against conversation between boarders." "No rule at all," Cole said. "I'd be glad to." She nodded with a brisk efficiency that was clearly her resting manner of managing the world, and she walked on down the street, and Cole watched her go, and then turned and walked in the opposite direction, and found himself smiling for no specific reason he could have articulated. Supper that evening was a considerably livelier affair than breakfast had been. Mrs. Houghton had made a roast chicken with potatoes and green beans, and the schoolteacher Davidson turned out to be genuinely funny in a dry, self-deprecating way that made the table feel comfortable. Abernathy was still talking about roads but had moved on to the agricultural potential of the Sulphur Springs Valley, which at least had some informational value. Clara sat across from Cole and they talked, genuinely talked, in the spaces between the other conversations. She had an alert, precise quality of attention when she was listening, a slight forward lean, and a habit of touching the locket at her throat, which she had apparently hung on a new ribbon she had purchased at the general store that morning. She asked good questions, and she listened carefully to the answers, and she had opinions that she expressed with a directness that Cole found deeply refreshing after years of conversations that circled around their actual subject for no good reason. She asked him about cattle ranching, about the specific mechanics of a cattle drive, about how a man determined the quality of grazing land, and he answered honestly and in detail, because her questions were serious ones and deserved serious answers. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her mother who had been a seamstress and who had taught her to sew when she was very young, about her father who had been a farmer and who had died of a fever when she was 17, leaving her and her mother to manage as best they could. "Which you did," Cole said. "Which we did," she agreed. "My mother was the most practical woman I have ever known. She could make something from almost nothing. Cloth, meals, money. She just looked at whatever she had and figured out what it could become." "Is that what's in the locket?" Cole asked. "The photograph." Clara touched it again, that automatic gesture. "Yes. She had it taken in Springfield, the year before she died. It was a great extravagance for her. She sent me a copy in a letter and I had it fitted to the locket." She paused. "When I lost the locket yesterday, it felt like losing her a second time." Cole was quiet for a moment. Around them, Davidson and Abernathy were arguing companionably about the merits of different grain varieties. Mrs. Houghton moved efficiently between the kitchen and the dining room. "My father's watch stopped the day he died," Cole said. "I've never had it repaired." Clara looked at him. "You carry it still, every day." "Then you understand," she said simply. "Yes," he said, "I do." The evening stretched long after the meal was cleared, and Clara and Cole ended up on the front porch of the boarding house in the warm summer darkness, sitting in two wooden chairs with Mrs. Houghton's marigolds visible as darker shapes against the night, and a sky overhead so packed with stars that it looked like something a person had invented and could not possibly be real. The coyotes were calling somewhere to the east, near the river, and the sounds of the Sulphur Spur carried faintly on the warm air, piano and laughter, and the muffled percussion of a busy night. Cole told her about growing up on his father's ranch, about learning to read cattle and land and sky from a man who understood all three with the depth of someone who had built his life around that understanding. He told her about the fire, briefly and without self-pity, because it was part of his story and she was listening, and he trusted her listening in a way that surprised him. She told him about her mother's final illness, about the months of care that had left Clara with nothing but a small sum of money and an excellent education in practical skills, and a deep determination to make something of herself in a territory that had not yet made up its mind about whether it valued practical women with excellent skills. "Missouri was not going to give me anything more than I already had," she said, "and I had already learned everything Missouri had to teach me." "And Arizona," Cole said. She was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars. "Arizona is still making up its mind about me," she said. "I have 8 months of evidence that it is a demanding and frequently unreasonable territory, but it is also," she paused, searching for the word, "larger than anything I was prepared for. Every morning when I wake up here, everything is bigger than I expected. The sky, the distances, the light. It is as if the entire landscape refuses to be small." Cole looked at her profile in the darkness, the clean line of her jaw and the way she held her head with a kind of habitual steadiness. "That's the most accurate thing I've ever heard anyone say about this territory," he said. She turned and looked at him, and in the dim light from the window behind them he could see her smile, not the small polite one from this morning but a fuller one, more unguarded, and it lit up her face in a way that did something to his chest again, that complicated and increasingly familiar thing. "You have lived here a long time," she said. "Most of my life," he said. "Do you ever think about leaving? Where would I go?" He said, not bitterly but with a genuine curiosity that was also, he realized as he said it, a genuine answer. This was where he was. The sky was his. The distances were his. The light was his. He had not been able to think of anything else as home since he was 16 years old. Clara was quiet for a moment. "That is either a very sad answer or a very content one," she said. "I cannot decide which." "Could be both," Cole said. She considered this. "Yes," she said finally, "it could be both." Mrs. Houghton appeared at the front door with a pointed look at the hour, and they said good night with the slightly ceremonious formality of two people who are aware that they have had a more significant conversation than the circumstances technically required, and who are not entirely sure what to do with that awareness. Cole lay on his narrow bed again that night and did not look at the ceiling. He looked at his father's stopped watch, which he had taken from his pocket and set on the small table beside the bed, and he thought about time and what it meant that he had happened to be walking down a particular stretch of road at a particular moment in the late afternoon. He had not believed in fate, exactly, but he had spent enough years reading the land to understand that some convergences were not accidental. The next 3 days in redemption established a rhythm that felt simultaneously easy and charged with an energy that neither Cole nor Clara fully acknowledged, but both clearly felt. They ate breakfast together and supper together, and in between, life in a small frontier town provided an endless series of small events and observations that became the material of their conversations. Cole helped the liveryman Burl fix a broken gate hinge, because he was not a man who could stand to watch something broken that he knew how to fix. Clara, it turned out, had the same quality, and she spent an afternoon at Mrs. Houghton's sewing machine repairing a quilt that had been languishing unmended for months. They both worked instinctively with their hands, and this created between them a mutual recognition that was deeper than any specific thing they said. He showed her the town, such as it was, introducing her to its small geography with the proprietary ease of someone who had been here 3 days longer than she had, which she found amusing in a way she did not bother to hide. They walked down to the Santa Cruz River one afternoon and sat on the bank in the cottonwood shade, watching the shallow green water move over smooth stones, and a great blue heron stood absolutely motionless in the shallows 30 yards away as though it had been placed there specifically to complete the scene. "Do you have rivers in Missouri?" Cole asked. "We have the Missouri River," she said with a slight note of amusement. "It is named for the entire state." "Right," he said, and she laughed, a quick, genuine laugh that was the best sound he had heard in years, possibly ever. "The rivers are different here," she said. "In Missouri they are green and slow and bordered by old trees. These Arizona rivers look like they are thinking about drying up and have simply decided not to yet." "Most of them do in August," Cole said. "That's what I mean," she said. "Everything here is committed to surviving against its own natural tendency, even the rivers." Cole thought about himself at 16, watching his father's ranch burn down to the red earth, and decided that she was right. "That's Arizona," he said. She was looking at the heron. "I think I understand why you could not think of anywhere else to go," she said quietly. He looked at her. The afternoon light came through the cottonwood leaves and moved in patches across her dark hair and her pale blue dress. The river made its soft sound. The heron did not move. "Do you think you could stay?" he asked, and the question was lighter and more casual than it actually was, which they both understood. She considered the river for a long moment. "I am waiting to find out," she said. "The letter will tell me a good deal." "The letter," he said, not quite sighing. "Yes," she said, "the letter." On the 4th day the letter arrived. Cole was in the livery with Scratch when Pete from the Silver Spur appeared at the door, apparently acting as an informal message carrier, and told him that Miss Ashford had received something from the telegraph office, and that Mrs. Houghton had thought he ought to know, which told Cole everything he needed to understand about how efficiently small towns processed information. He found Clara in the sitting room, the letter open in her lap, and her expression had the particular stillness of a person who has received news they need time to process. She looked up when he came in and said, "Please sit down," which was not how he had expected her to greet him. He sat. "The position at the ranch outside Tombstone has changed," she said. "The owner has written to say that he has reconsidered the arrangement. He has hired a local woman instead and no longer requires my services." Cole absorbed this. "I'm sorry," he said, because he was. "I am also sorry," she said, with a precise steadiness that told him she was managing several emotions at once. "I was counting on that position. I have enough money to stay here perhaps 2 more weeks, and then I will need to make other arrangements." "What other arrangements?" She folded the letter with a careful exactness. I have been corresponding with an agency in Tucson that places domestic workers. I can likely find a position as a housekeeper or seamstress somewhere in the territory. It will simply require returning to Tucson to register with them in person, which I cannot do until after I have resolved my financial situation here. She paused. It is manageable. I have managed before. You have, Cole agreed. And then, because he was not a man who thought something clearly and then failed to say it, he said, I know a rancher outside of Tombstone. His name is Walt Fielding, and he has been looking for a seamstress for his household for the better part of a year because his wife manages 3 children and a full ranch and has no time. I rode with Walt on a cattle drive 2 years ago. He's a good man. Clara looked at him steadily. Are you telling me you can give me a letter of introduction? I'm telling you I can do better than that. I can take you there myself. He said it with the careful deliberateness of a man who knows exactly what he is saying and has thought about it long enough to be sure. I have nothing particular to do this week, and Tombstone is 2 days south. I was planning to head in that direction anyway. He was planning nothing of the sort. She probably knew that. She looked at him for a long moment. The sitting room was quiet around them, the ticking of Mrs. Houghton's mantel clock marking the seconds. That is a significant offer, she said. It's 2 days on the road, he said. I know the route. You'd be safer with a guide than on the stage, which only runs on Tuesdays. Today is Thursday, she said. Yes, he said. The corner of her mouth did the thing it did. You have thought this through. Some, he admitted. And you would simply accompany me as a guide, she said. And there was something in the phrasing that acknowledged what they were both carefully not fully saying. The fact that 2 days on the road together was not precisely a neutral arrangement. That something was happening between them that was larger than a found locket and a few conversations. He confirmed. And someone who can vouch for you to Walt Fielding, who is not easy to impress but who trusts the word of people who have worked alongside him. She thought about it for one more moment, and then she said, All right, Mr. Danver, I will accept your offer. Cole, he said. She looked at him. All right, Cole. His name in her voice was a particular experience that he stored carefully and did not examine too closely, the way you do not look directly at a very bright thing. They left the following morning on borrowed horses from the livery, Scratch carrying Cole, and a solid gray mare named Bess carrying Clara, who turned out to ride with a competence that pleased him in a way he could not entirely account for. She sat a horse straight and steady, and had the natural balance of someone who had learned young and had not forgotten, even after years in a town where horses were transportation rather than partners. The road south followed the valley of the Santa Cruz before cutting east toward the Tombstone Hills, and the landscape changed as they rode, the river cottonwoods giving way to scrubby grassland dotted with mesquite and ocotillo, the mountains blue and distant on both sides. The sky was enormous and relentlessly blue, and the summer heat was already building by mid-morning, pressing down on the land with the focused intensity of a deliberate intent. They talked as they rode. Not constantly, because 2 days on the road does not require constant talk, and both of them were comfortable with silence in the way that people are comfortable with silence only when they trust the person beside them. But they talked more than Cole had talked in a very long time, and he was aware of it as an unusual condition, like finding a spring in dry country. She asked him about the ranches they passed, about who owned them and how they had been established, and whether they were doing well. He knew most of it, not through formal knowledge but through the accumulated observation of a man who had been moving through this territory for 12 years and paying attention the whole time. She listened to each piece of information with the same focused attention she brought to everything and filed it somewhere useful. He could tell, because her questions built on each other in a way that showed genuine comprehension. He asked her about her sewing, about what she could actually make and at what level of skill, because if he was going to recommend her to Walt Fielding, he wanted to know what he was recommending. She described, with a matter-of-fact precision that was not boastfulness but was also not false modesty, a level of skill that was genuinely impressive. Her mother had been an excellent seamstress and had trained her rigorously from childhood. She could make dresses, shirts, working clothes, and formal wear. She could repair and alter with equal facility, and she could make curtains, quilts, and other household textiles with the same competence. Walt's wife Martha will want to know about the quilts particularly, Cole said. She has been trying to get the household curtains replaced for 2 years and hasn't had time to do it herself. I can do curtains in a week, Clara said, depending on the windows. It's a ranch house, not a palace, Cole said, but it's well built. Walt built it himself when he and Martha came out from Texas in 1874. You know him well, she observed. Well enough, Cole said. He's the kind of man you remember. Fair, hard-working, doesn't say much he doesn't mean. Martha is the same, only she also doesn't have a great deal of patience for inefficiency, which I say as a compliment. Clara smiled. She sounds like my mother. They made camp that evening in a shallow draw near a small spring, a spot Cole knew from previous trips and that offered both water and shelter from the wind. He built a small fire, and they ate from the provisions he had packed, dried beef and biscuits and dried apple slices. And the simplicity of it felt natural in a way that more elaborate meals rarely did. The fire burned low, and the stars came out with the same extravagance they had shown above Redemption, and the desert at night had a particular quality of stillness that was nothing like emptiness but felt instead like a held breath, as though everything was very quietly present and had simply chosen to be quiet about it. Clara had the locket open in her palm, looking at the photograph inside by the firelight. Cole could not see the image clearly from where he sat, just the small oval glow of it. She looks happy in it, Clara said, not looking up. She was not always happy, I think, but when they took the photograph she was smiling, and I choose to believe that it was real and not just for the camera. She paused. She worked so hard. All of her life she worked, and she took joy in the work, but she also deserved more ease than she got. What would she think of you being here? Cole asked. Arizona, the road, all of it. Clara was quiet for a moment. She would think I was very brave, she said. And she would also think I was extremely stubborn, because she always said those two things about me in the same breath, as though one required the other. The small smile again, directed at the photograph. Would want me to know that she approved. I think she does know wherever she is. I think that is why losing the locket felt like losing her presence, not just her image. Cole looked at the fire. My father used to say that the dead don't go far, just somewhere we can't see yet. Clara looked up from the locket. In the firelight, her gray-green eyes were darker, more complex. Do you believe that? Some nights more than others, he said honestly. Tonight, she asked. He thought about it. The fire crackled. The desert breathed its slow, held breath. Somewhere nearby a nighthawk called. Tonight, he said, more than most. She held the locket a moment longer, and then she closed it gently and tucked it back beneath her collar against her skin, and looked at the fire, and they sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was full of something, the way the desert at night is full of something even when it appears to be perfectly empty. Cole, she said after a while. Yes. Thank you, not just for finding the locket, for all of this. He looked at her across the fire. You don't need to thank me, he said. I know, she said. I want to. He held her gaze for a moment, and what passed between them in that moment was not something that could have been translated into any particular word or phrase. But it was real and it was significant, and they both knew it. The way you know a spring is under the ground before you have finished digging, because the earth changes beneath the shovel. They rode into Tombstone the following afternoon, through the hard, bright light that had made this particular corner of the Sulphur Springs Valley famous for a quality of sunshine that was somehow more direct and unmediated than what fell elsewhere. The town in 1882 was at the height of its boom, the silver mines running full tilt, the streets busy with miners, ranchers, merchants, gamblers, and every variety of frontier person that could be produced by a combination of opportunity and hope and desperation. Cole navigated through the busy main streets with the ease of familiarity, and Clara rode beside him and watched everything with her characteristic focused attention, missing nothing. The town was louder and rougher than Redemption, more raw at its edges, but it also had a vitality that was something between exciting and alarming. "You were not wrong about it being rough," she said. "It's got better since last year," he said, which was accurate. The events of late 1881 had left their mark on the town, but by the summer of 1882 a measure of order had been reestablished, and commerce was the primary occupation of most of its citizens. Walt Fielding's ranch was 6 miles northeast of Tombstone proper, on a piece of the valley floor that caught the morning light and had access to a reliable well and good grassland. Cole had been there twice before and knew the road. They arrived in the mid-afternoon to find Walt himself mending fence at the perimeter of the property. A large, quiet man in his early 40s, with a sun-dark face and slow, deliberate movements that suggested he had learned long ago that the work was always there, and that hurrying through it only meant doing it again. Walt Fielding looked up from his fencing when Cole and Clara rode up, and the expression on his face moved through recognition to surprise to genuine pleasure over the course of about 3 seconds. "Cole Danver," he said, setting down his fencing pliers. "What brings you out this way?" Cole shook his hand. "I have someone I'd like you to meet, and a proposition I think you'll find interesting." He turned to Clara, who had dismounted and was standing with the composed directness that he had come to understand was simply how she occupied space. "Walt Fielding, this is Clara Ashford. She's a seamstress from Missouri, trained well and experienced. She came to Arizona to work and had a position fall through. I told her you might need someone." Walt looked at Clara with the evaluating directness of a man who had no time for social performance and valued competence above manners. "Mrs. Houghton's quilts are the talk of Redemption," he said unexpectedly. "Martha has been wanting someone who can make proper curtains for 2 years. "I can make curtains," Clara said without embellishment. "And dresses. Martha has 4 dresses and 3 of them are past mending. Dresses as well, formal or working. Both. Mostly working, but she want one that isn't ashamed to wear to church." "That's straightforward," Clara said. "I would need to see the fabrics available and the measurements, and I can tell you what I can accomplish and in what time." Walt looked at Cole with the specific expression of a man who has just heard exactly what he wanted to hear. Cole kept his face neutral. "Come up to the house," Walt said. "Martha will want to meet you." Martha Fielding was precisely as Cole had described her, a lean, quick-moving woman with intelligent eyes and an absolute absence of patience for anything that was not useful. She shook Clara's hand with a firm grip and said, "Can you make a bed curtain? I have been trying to keep the dust out of the sleeping area for 3 years." "I can make a bed curtain," Clara said. "I'll need a measurement of the posts." Martha looked at Cole with an expression that plainly said, "Wherever did you find this woman?" and then looked back at Clara and said, "You'll start Monday," which was how Clara Ashford came to be employed at the Fielding Ranch outside Tombstone, Arizona, in the summer of 1882. Cole stayed at the Fielding place that night, as Walt insisted, and in the morning he faced the considerably less pleasant reality that he had no particular reason to remain in the area. He had no job waiting, no obligation holding him here. He had delivered Clara to exactly the situation she needed. His role in the story, as far as anyone could have written it from the outside, was complete. He went to find Scratch in Walt's stable, and Clara found him there, as though she had known that was where he would be. She stood in the stable doorway with the morning light behind her, and he turned and saw her, and the thing in his chest that had been building for 5 days hit a particular note that he felt all the way through. "You are leaving," she said. It was not a question exactly. "No particular reason to stay," he said, which was exactly the wrong thing to say, and he knew it before the words were finished. Something moved across her face. She took 1 step into the stable and then stopped. "You could find work here," she said carefully. "Walt mentioned last night that he is short-handed. 2 of his ranch hands left last month for the mines. He needs at least 1 good rider who knows cattle." Cole looked at Scratch. The horse looked back at him with the absolute indifference of a very sensible animal. "Did Walt mention it or did you bring it up?" Cole asked. Clara's chin came up fractionally. "Does it matter?" "Some," he said. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was steady and direct in a way that he understood cost her something, because she was a person who guarded her dignity carefully, and this was walking close to the edge of it. "I would like you to stay," she said. "I am aware that is a forward thing to say after 5 days, and you may think whatever you like about it. But I find that I am not good at being indirect about things that matter." Cole looked at her for a long moment. The morning light came through the stable windows in dusty golden columns and fell across the straw and the horses and her dark hair and her steady gray-green eyes, and the entire picture had the quality of something he would remember with exact clarity for the rest of his life. "Neither am I," he said. He talked to Walt Fielding after breakfast. The work Walt needed was exactly what Cole was good at. Managing a small cattle herd, maintaining fences, the endless physical work of keeping a ranch operational with limited hands. Walt paid a fair wage and offered a bunk in the small ranch hand quarters, a single-room structure near the stable that was clean and solid. Cole accepted, and the handshake they exchanged had the solidity of men who had worked together before and trusted each other's word. The weeks that followed were the most grounded Cole had felt in 12 years. He rose before dawn with the particular satisfaction of a man who has work that fits him, who knows what the day requires and has the tools to provide it. He rode fence lines in the early morning when the heat was still manageable, and the desert had that quality of translucent light that existed only in the hour after sunrise. He worked cattle and helped Walt with the dozen tasks that a working ranch generates daily, endlessly, with the patient repetition of something that was not a burden but a rhythm. In the evenings, the Fielding household had supper together, and Clara was there. She ate with the family, which Martha had insisted upon, and the conversation at the table was comfortable and varied in the way that conversation is when people are all working hard toward related goals and have genuine things to report and discuss. Cole watched Clara with Walt and Martha's children, 3 of them, a boy of 8 named James and 2 girls of 6 and 4 named Patience and Rose. She was not effusive with them, not the kind of adult who performs enthusiasm at children, but she was genuinely interested in them in a practical way that they responded to immediately. She taught Patience to do a simple running stitch in the evenings while she worked on the household curtains, and the 6-year-old sat beside her with a concentration that was clearly inherited from Martha, and produced a sampler of running stitches so straight they could have been ruled. Cole one evening found himself teaching James to tie a proper bowline knot on the porch, with Clara sitting on the porch steps nearby working on a dress for Martha, and commenting occasionally on his instruction methods. And it was the most domestic and specific moment of contentment he had experienced since he was a child on his father's ranch, before everything had been reduced to ash, and he had learned to move through the world without expecting it to be permanent. He recognized the feeling, and it frightened him slightly in the way that something you want very much always frightens you, because you know the distance between wanting and having, and you know it can be crossed in either direction without warning. He said none of this aloud. He showed it instead, in the way he paid attention to whatever Clara was doing when they occupied the same space, in the way he remembered what she had said the previous day, and built on it in the next conversation, in the way he arranged his days so that the hour before supper was spent near the house rather than in the far reaches of the property. She showed it back, in ways that were equally unspoken. She set aside the second-best biscuits at breakfast when she had helped Martha bake and gave them to whoever happened by the kitchen, but she set aside the actual best biscuits and left them on the work table where Cole would find them when he came in from the morning's work. She asked him questions at supper that she had thought of during the day, which meant she had been thinking of him during the day. She found reasons to be near the stable when he was working there. Mrs. Fielding watched all of this with a composure that did not quite conceal her satisfaction, and Walt Fielding said nothing, because he was not a man who spoke about things that were progressing exactly as they ought to. 6 weeks into this arrangement, on a Sunday afternoon in August when the heat had driven everyone into the shade, and the children had been put down for their afternoon rest, Cole found Clara sitting on the porch with a book in her lap but not reading it, looking out at the valley where the heat made the distant mountains shimmer like something in a dream. He sat down on the steps beside her, a position he had taken many times before, and she did not adjust her position or tighten her posture in the way that people do when proximity feels wrong. She simply continued looking at the mountains and said, "What do you see when you look out there?" "Grazing land," he said honestly. "The water situation, whether the grass is going to hold through August," she smiled without turning. "That is the most practical answer possible. I'm a practical person." "You are," she agreed, "but you also notice everything. I've watched you. You see the light on the rocks in the morning. I can tell from where you look, even when you're working on something that requires no looking at rocks." He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother taught you to look at everything," he said. "She did," Clara said. "And your father, I think, did the same for you. Whatever you say about being practical." He looked at her profile, the line of her face in the afternoon shade, the ribbon at her collar with the locket beneath it. Something that had been building for 6 weeks reached a place that required speech or would not be bearable. "Clara," he said. She turned to look at him. He had thought about how to say this and had not come up with anything better than the truth. "I have been in one place for 6 weeks," he said. "That hasn't happened since I was 16 years old. And the reason I've stayed isn't the cattle or the wage or the fact that Walt is a good employer, though all of those things are true." Her expression was very still, the way it was when she was listening most carefully. "The reason I've stayed," he said, "is you. And I need you to know that because I am not good at being indirect about things that matter, which is something I learned from someone recently." The small curve of her mouth appeared. "That is somewhat familiar," she said. "I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment that felt like a very long time and was probably 15 seconds. The heat pressed down on the valley. The mountains shimmered. A quail called somewhere in the scrub grass. "Cole," she said. "I came to Arizona alone with very little money and no certainty about anything. I have spent 8 months learning to rely entirely on myself, which I believe was necessary and which I do not regret. But I did not come here expecting to find." She paused, and for the first time in his experience of her, she appeared genuinely uncertain about a word, as though she had encountered something for which her precise vocabulary was not quite adequate. "This," she said finally. "Whatever this is." "I know what it is," Cole said quietly. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "So do I." He reached out, slowly and deliberately, and took her hand where it lay on the arm of her chair. Her fingers were slightly rough from weeks of sewing, and warm, and after a single moment of stillness she turned her hand and held his hand back, with a pressure that was firm and certain, and nothing like tentative. They sat like that in the afternoon shade, while the valley shimmered and the quail called, and the mountains held their ground against the heat, and Cole felt the ground beneath him solidify into something he had not stood on in a very long time. Over the following weeks, what had been carefully unspoken became, gradually and naturally, spoken. They walked in the evenings when the heat had eased, along the fence line toward the east where the mountains caught the last light and turned shades of rose and amber that were frankly excessive and entirely sincere. He told her things he had not told anyone in years, not because he was a secretive man, but because there had not been anyone who asked the right questions in the right way. She told him about Missouri, about her childhood, about the specific texture of grief, and the way it changes over time without ever entirely leaving. She told him once, on one of those evening walks, about a man she had briefly considered marrying in Springfield before her mother's illness had redirected everything. She told it without drama or self-consciousness, as a fact about her history, and he listened with the same gravity he brought to all of her history. "Were you in love with him?" Cole asked. "I thought I might be," she said, considering it carefully. "But I think I was in love with the idea of stability rather than with the person himself." He was a steady man. He had a good farm. She paused. He also had very little interest in knowing what I actually thought about anything, which I managed not to notice for longer than I should have. That's a difficult thing to miss, Cole said. Yes, she said. It is easier to miss than you would think when you have other concerns. She glanced at him. You ask me what I think about things constantly. I want to know, he said simply. I know, she said. That is the difference. There was a particular evening in late September when the temperature had finally broken, and the evenings were cool enough to be genuinely pleasant, when Martha Fielding had put the children to bed, and she and Walt were sitting in the front room, and Cole and Clara were in the kitchen working through the last of the apple harvest together, peeling and coring apples for the preserves that Martha would put up over the following days. The kitchen smelled wonderfully of apples and the wood stove and the beeswax candles, and outside the window the first stars were appearing over the valley. They worked side by side at the kitchen table, Clara with efficient speed and Cole more slowly but steadily, and they talked about nothing in particular: the next week's work, the question of whether it would be an early winter, the state of James's arithmetic lessons, which Clara had been informally assisting with when she had time. It was the most ordinary conversation in the world, and also, Cole thought, the most extraordinary, because ordinary conversations between two people who are in love with each other carry within them an entirely different weight of meaning than their surface content suggests. He put down his paring knife and turned to look at her. She was focused on the apple in her hands, her expression the particular one of mild concentration she wore for tasks that were well within her ability. The candlelight was warm on her face, and the locket lay at her throat where it always lay, the new ribbon holding it in place. "Clara," he said. She looked up. "I love you," he said, directly and completely, without preamble or softening, because he was not a man who said important things halfway. She set down her apple and her knife with deliberate care. She looked at him, and her gray-green eyes had a brilliance in the candlelight that was not entirely the candles. "I love you too, Cole Danver," she said. "I have for quite some time." "How long?" he asked. She considered this with apparent seriousness. "Approximately since you sat on Mrs. Houghton's porch and told me that your answer was either very sad or very content and could be both." He stared at her. "That was the second evening." "Yes," she said. "I am aware." He reached out and touched her face, very gently, cupping her jaw in one hand, and she turned her face into his hand and closed her eyes briefly, and he kissed her there in Mrs. Fielding's apple-smelling kitchen with the candles burning and the stars coming out over the Sulphur Springs Valley, and it was a kiss that had the quality of something that had been a long time arriving, and now that it had arrived would not be departing again. From the front room, there was the specific sound of Martha Fielding saying something to Walt in a very quiet voice, followed by a long silence, followed by what might have been Walt making a sound of contentment. They had, Cole suspected, been expecting this for some time. The autumn was golden. That was the word that came to him later when he tried to describe it to himself, not as a metaphor but as a literal description of the quality of the light in those weeks. The angle of the Arizona sun in October laying everything in a warm, thick gold that made even the most ordinary things look remarkable. The cattle moved well in the cooler weather, and the fence lines held, and the ranch had the satisfying sense of something that was working properly, that had the right number of people doing the right amount of work. He asked Walt Fielding for a private conversation one morning in early October, and Walt listened to what he had to say with his characteristic unhurried attention, and when Cole was finished, Walt said, "You don't need my permission." "No," Cole said. "I know, but I have a great deal of respect for your opinion." Walt was quiet for a moment. "She's the best worker Martha has had in 10 years, he said. "She's also the most straight-thinking woman I've met outside of my wife. You'd be a fool to let her get away, and you're not a fool." He paused. "Also, Martha would never forgive you if you botched this." "That's motivating," Cole said. "It ought to be," Walt agreed. He had ridden into Tombstone the previous week, and spent an amount of money that represented a significant portion of his savings on a ring from the assier's shop. A small gold band set with a pale blue turquoise stone, the exact color of the Arizona sky on a clear morning. He had carried it in his pocket all week alongside his father's stopped watch, and the two of them had knocked together occasionally as he moved through his days, which he found somewhat poetic. On a Sunday afternoon in early October, he and Clara walked their usual evening route along the fence line toward the eastern mountains, except that Cole walked slower than usual and found reasons to stop and look at things, which Clara noticed and did not comment on, though he was aware of her awareness. The mountains in the late afternoon had their autumn colors, the creosote and the desert grasses going gold and amber against the blue, and the sky above was that impossible Arizona depth that went on past the limit of sight. He stopped at the place where the fence line turned east, and you could see the full reach of the valley to the south, the mountains of Mexico faint blue on the horizon 30 miles away, the entire enormous space of the territory laid out in front of you like an argument for staying. He turned to face her. She looked at him with those gray-green eyes that saw everything, and she was already smiling, not the small, polite smile or even the unguarded one he had first seen at Mrs. Houghton's table, but something warmer and more certain than either. "Clara Ashford," he said. He took the ring from his pocket and she looked at it, and her hand came up to the locket at her throat in that automatic gesture he knew so well. "I have been a man without a fixed place since I was 16 years old, and I have told myself for 12 years that this was simply who I was. I was wrong. I just hadn't found the place yet." He paused. "Or the person." Her eyes were bright. "I would like to build a life with you," he said. "Right here, in this territory that is too large and too committed to surviving against its own nature for its own good. I would like to have a house with your curtains on the windows and a kitchen that smells like apples, and I would like to spend the rest of my life asking you what you think about things, because I always want to know." He held out the ring. "Will you marry me, Clara?" She did not hesitate. She stepped forward and put her hand in his and said, "Yes, Cole," without reservation and without uncertainty. "Yes." He put the ring on her finger, and the turquoise stone caught the afternoon light and threw it back as a small point of blue brightness. And then she put her arms around him and her face against his shoulder, and he held her with both arms, and the valley stretched out golden around them, and the mountains held their ancient watch over the whole proceedings with a sublime indifference that felt, in this moment, exactly like blessing. They were married in November, in the small church on the edge of Tombstone that had a minister named Reverend Claymore, who had the particular gift of conducting ceremonies that were solemn and warm at the same time. Walt and Martha stood as witnesses, and the 3 Fielding children were in the front pew with varying degrees of understanding of the occasion. James grave and attentive, Patience wearing the new dress that Clara had made for her and absolutely aware of it, and Rose, aged 4, falling asleep against her brother's arm before the vows were complete. The vows were simple and direct. Cole said his with the steady plainness of a man who means every word and wastes none. Clara said hers with the clear-voiced precision of a woman who has decided something fully and says so. When Reverend Claymore announced them married and Cole took her face in his hands and kissed her, Martha Fielding made a sound that was half laugh and half the other thing, and Walt put his arm around his wife's shoulders. The wedding supper was at the Fielding Ranch, a genuinely excellent meal that Martha and Clara had prepared together over 2 days, and the table was extended with boards to fit everyone who came, because it turned out that 6 weeks of working alongside the Tombstone area ranching community had given Cole a larger circle of acquaintance than he had fully reckoned with. And Clara had made enough good impressions through Walt and Martha's network that a number of people were genuinely pleased to come and celebrate. Burl, the livery man from Redemption, had ridden down when he heard the news through some channel that Frontier information traveled by. Pete from the Silver Spur had sent a bottle of excellent whiskey with his congratulations. Even Mrs. Houghton had sent a letter, delivered with the weekly stage, that said, in her precise boarding housekeeper's prose, that she was very glad to hear it, and had rather suspected something was in train from the second evening onward. They spent their first nights together in the small room Martha had made available in the ranch house until their own place was ready, and Cole lay in the dark with Clara's head on his shoulder and listened to the Arizona night through the window and thought that his father had been right, that the dead don't go far, just somewhere you can't see yet, because he could feel his father in the rightness of this, could feel the steady presence of a man who had built something, and who would have recognized exactly what his son was building now. The ranch hand quarters where Cole had been living were expanded over the winter months into something larger, a proper house with 2 rooms and a porch, and eventually, windows that Clara measured for curtains on the first morning she came to see it. Cole built the walls and the roof with Walt's help, and with the help of 2 neighboring ranchers who came to work in exchange for Cole's labor on their own projects, the reciprocal economy of frontier settlement that made things possible that could not otherwise happen. Clara managed the budget for the house and the materials with the precision that her mother had taught her, and that she had been refining through necessity for years. She was very good at it, not in a pinching or anxious way, but in the way of someone who understood the relationship between what you had and what you wanted and knew how to navigate the distance between the two. She continued to work for Martha Fielding through the winter, not because she had to, but because the work was honest and Martha was good company, and the income was useful as they built their savings. Cole worked the ranch and did additional jobs as they came, riding for neighboring outfits during roundup season, doing work that needed doing, building a reputation in the valley as a man who knew cattle and kept his word. In the spring of 1883, Clara told him she was pregnant. He was in the stable when she found him, as she so often did, and she came in with a morning light behind her that was already warm with the promise of another Arizona summer, and she said, with her characteristic directness, "I am going to have a baby." He turned from the horse he was brushing and looked at her, and whatever his face did in that moment made her laugh, which was a good sound in the early morning stable. "You look stunned," she said. "I'm not stunned," he said, recovering himself. He crossed to her in 3 steps and took her hands, and then, deciding that was not sufficient, put his arms around her. "I'm not stunned at all." Tried to find the word and found several at once and settled on, "I'm glad." "Good," she said, her face against his shoulder. "Because I am too." He held her in the morning light and thought about his father's ranch, the one that had burned, and how loss is not the end of a line but a bend in it, and how the life you build on the other side of loss can contain all the things that came before it without being diminished by them, and can be, in fact, enriched by the knowledge of what is fragile and what endures. The spring and summer were busy in the way that life with 2 working people and a ranch and a growing household is busy, which is to say constantly and productively, with enough to do at all times to keep the days full and enough rest at the end of them to make the next day possible. Clara's pregnancy was straightforward, and she was characteristically practical about it, continuing her work with modifications as her condition required and refusing to be managed or overcautioned in a way that made Cole laugh, because it was so entirely her. Martha Fielding was a tremendous resource, having done this 3 times herself and being constitutionally inclined toward useful information rather than either alarm or false reassurance. She told Clara what to expect and what to watch for, and what was entirely normal and what was not, and the 2 women had developed by this point the kind of friendship that is built on mutual respect and genuine affection and shared work, which is the best kind. In October of 1883, exactly 1 year after Cole had proposed on the fence line with the valley golden around them, their son was born. He was born in their own house, in the room with Clara's curtains on the windows, with Martha Fielding present and capable and Walt pacing in front of the house with Cole, because it turned out that competent men are equally useless in this particular situation, regardless of how many fences they have mended. The baby was healthy and loud, and had a remarkable amount of dark hair for a person who had existed in the world for approximately 4 minutes. He weighed what he ought to weigh, and he had all the relevant parts, and he announced his arrival with a wholehearted commitment to being heard that suggested he had inherited something from both of his parents. Cole held him for the first time with the careful certainty of a man who has held a great many things that matter and knows how to be gentle with them. The baby looked up at him with the unfocused blue eyes of the newly arrived and made a sound that was not a cry but something quieter, as though he was considering the situation. "Hello," Cole said to him, which was all he could manage. Clara, from the bed, watched this with an expression that was so full and complex that she simply let it be all of those things without trying to resolve them into something smaller. "What will we call him?" she asked. Cole looked at the boy and thought about a man who had built something from the red Arizona earth and raised a son on it and who had died before his time but had left behind everything that mattered. "Thomas," he said, "after my father." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Thomas Cole Danver." "Yes," Cole said. He brought the baby to her, and she took him with the same competence she brought to everything. And she held him against her and looked down at him with that full, complicated expression. And then she looked up at Cole and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. He sat beside her on the bed and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him. And Thomas Cole Danver, 8 hours old and entirely unaware of the weight of his name, and the love that had produced him and the territory he had arrived into, slept against his mother's chest with the absolute confidence of someone who has never yet had reason to doubt that the world is a safe and sufficient place. The years that followed were good years. Not easy ones, because the Arizona territory did not trade in ease and had no particular interest in providing it, but good in the way that a life is good when it has the right shape, when the work fits the person doing it, and the people around you are ones you would choose again. Thomas grew with a speed that seemed physically impossible but was apparently normal, because every person they mentioned it to simply nodded and said yes. That is what children do, as though this was not remarkable at all. He had Cole's coloring and Clara's eyes and the combined stubbornness of both of his parents, which was a formidable quantity, and which manifested by the age of 3 as an extremely strong opinions about horses, a genuine talent for finding mud in a desert, and a habit of asking questions that went several layers deeper than the surface of things, which delighted his parents and occasionally exhausted everyone else. Cole built the ranch up steadily in those years, starting with a small herd of his own cattle that he ran on a piece of land he leased from a neighboring operation with an option to purchase when he had the funds. He was methodical about it, not a gambling man by nature, patient with the kind of patience that knows the difference between waiting and acting and chooses correctly between them. By 1885, he had purchased the land outright. By 1886, the herd had grown to a size that required a full-time hand in addition to Cole himself, and he hired a young man from the valley named Emilio Gutierrez, who was 20 years old and had been working cattle since he was Thomas's current age, and who was one of the best natural horsemen Cole had ever seen. Emilio became part of the household in the way that good workers sometimes do, not as family exactly, but as the particular kind of presence that a small operation requires, someone who is reliable and skilled, and whose investment in the enterprise goes beyond the wage. He ate supper with Cole and Clara most evenings, and he taught Thomas to whistle, and he took his hat off in the house without being asked, which Clara appreciated. In the spring of 1886, Clara told Cole she was pregnant again. This time he was in the kitchen when she told him, and he said, immediately and without the stunned pause of the first time, "Good," and kissed her, which she said later was exactly the right response. Their daughter was born in August, small and fierce and apparently in a great hurry, arriving so quickly that Martha Fielding nearly missed the birth entirely, and Cole himself delivered her in the first minutes of the morning with Thomas asleep in the next room, and the desert outside the window beginning to show its first gray light. He had been terrified. He did not say this afterward, but Clara, who had been considerably more occupied with the actual situation than he had, knew it and said, in the immediate aftermath when they had both confirmed that everyone was fine and alive and correct, "You did very well. You did all of it," he said. "You helped," she said. "At the right moment, you helped." They named her Eleanor after Clara's mother. Eleanor Rose Danver, the middle name for the ranch and for the year, and for the engraving on the locket that had brought them to each other. Eleanor was loud and definite from her first hour and remained so. By the time she was walking, she had established a complete hierarchy of her preferences and was prepared to articulate them at length and at volume. Thomas, aged 3 when she arrived, considered her with the grave skepticism of a person who has had things precisely as he wished them, and has now been presented with an unignorable variable. Within 6 months, he was completely devoted to her. Cole watched his children and his wife across the distance of years that accumulated with an increasing speed that he found both alarming and wonderful. The way the best things are always going faster than you want them to, but are so good while they are happening that the speed itself becomes part of the goodness. He kept his father's watch on the table beside their bed, still stopped, still cracked. Clara never asked him to have it repaired or to put it away, because she understood what it was for. She kept her mother's locket at her throat every day, on the same blue ribbon that she replaced when it wore through, always the same shade of blue, always the same length. On Thomas's 5th birthday, in October of 1888, Cole gave his son the watch. Thomas turned it over in his small hands with the serious attention he brought to everything, looking at the cracked glass and the stopped hands and the initials on the back, which were his grandfather's and were therefore now also, in the way of these things, his. "It doesn't work," Thomas said. "No," Cole said. "Why do you keep it?" Cole crouched down to his son's level. "Because some things are worth keeping even when they're broken," he said. "Because what they mean is larger than what they do." Thomas considered this with his gray-green eyes that were his mother's eyes exactly, in his father's face. "Like Mama's locket," he said. "Yes," Cole said. "Exactly like Mama's locket." Clara, standing in the doorway of the ranch house with Eleanor on her hip and the afternoon light on her face, heard this exchange and pressed her lips together and looked at the mountains, because there are moments when you need to look at something larger than yourself in order to contain what you are feeling. By 1889, the Danver Ranch was a going concern in the Sulphur Springs Valley, small but sound, with a good herd and good land, and a reputation for honest dealing that Cole had built over 7 years of consistent behavior. He was not a wealthy man, not in the way that the great cattle barons of the territory were wealthy, but he was a solvent and respected one, which mattered more to him. Walt Fielding remained his closest neighbor and friend, and Walt and Martha's children had grown alongside Thomas and Eleanor in the way that children grow when the families around them are stable and good, with a dozen shared memories and a dozen more being made every season. James Fielding, now 12, had already decided he was going to be a rancher like his father, and Thomas, at 6, had already decided the same thing, and they spent an inordinate amount of time together making extremely detailed plans about cattle and land that were more sophisticated than their ages would suggest. The territory itself was changing around them. The silver mines at Tombstone had begun to play out by the mid-1880s, the water table rising in the lower shafts faster than the pumps could manage, and the booming certainty of the early part of the decade had given way to a more measured economy. Many of the boomtown characters had moved on to the next excitement, and what remained was something quieter and, Cole thought, more real. The ranchers and the farmers and the merchants who had come not for the quick money, but to build something permanent. Arizona was not yet a state, would not be a state until 1912, and in the meantime operated as a territory with all the provisional quality that implied. But provisional did not mean temporary, and the people who were building here were building with the understanding that what they made would outlast them, would be the ground under their children's feet and their children's children's feet, which was both the weight and the gift of the choice to stay. Cole thought about this on an evening in the autumn of 1889, on the porch of the house he had built with Walt's help and his own hands, watching the last light go amber and then rose and then deep blue over the mountains to the west, with Clara beside him in the other chair, and the children inside doing whatever children do when the day is winding down and the supper is done. "I was thinking today," Clara said, "about Mrs. Houghton. What about her? I wonder if she still has the room on the second floor that you stayed in. I wonder if she is still growing marigolds." "Probably," Cole said. "She seemed like a marigolds every year kind of woman." "She was," Clara agreed. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had walked down a different road that afternoon?" He thought about the locket in the red dust, the way the late afternoon light had caught it, the half-buried chain. He thought about the quality of stopness he had felt in that moment, as though the earth had reached up and grabbed him by the ankle. "No," he said. She looked at him. "I don't think about it," he said, "because it didn't happen. I walked down that road and I found it. That's the story." He paused. "I've spent a lot of years of my life thinking about things that happened differently than I wished they had. My father's ranch, the fire, a dozen other things. I've learned that the road you didn't take doesn't have anything useful to tell you. The road you took, that one has everything." Clara looked at him with that full, complex expression, the one that contained all the years and all the miles and all the mornings and all the conversations and all the love that had been building since a sitting room in Redemption and a locket and a burst of tears and two people who were not good at being indirect about things that mattered. "The road you took," she said softly. "This one," he said. "Right here." She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand in his, and he held it as he always did, with a pressure that was firm and certain and nothing like tentative. Inside, Eleanor said something imperious, and Thomas responded with the patient practicality of an older brother who has learned that the path of least resistance is to take his sister's announcements seriously and investigate them before dismissing them. Their voices were warm and indistinct through the window, the sound of children in a house at the end of a day, which was one of the most purely good sounds the world contained. The mountains held the last light on their peaks for a long moment, rose and amber against the deep blue of the coming night, and then let it go. The stars came out over the Sulphur Springs Valley with their customary extravagance, the sky so thick with them that the darkness between them was almost not darkness at all, but just a different kind of light. The locket lay at Clara's throat. The stopped watch was on Thomas's bedside table, where Cole had told him to keep it, so that it could remind him every morning of something worth remembering. The ring with the turquoise stone caught a last small point of starlight from Clara's hand, where it had been for 6 years and would be. He knew with the particular certainty of a man who has learned how to know things, for all the years to come. He had been a man without a fixed place. He had learned, later than some but not too late, that a fixed place is not a point on a map but a condition of the heart, something you find not by arriving at it but by recognizing it when you are in it, the way you recognize a spring under dry ground before you have finished digging, because the earth changes beneath the shovel and you know before you see. He was in it now. He had been in it for 6 years and would be for 30 more, for the rest of his life on this red Arizona earth under this impossible sky, with this woman beside him and these children in this house, and the mountains on the horizon holding their ancient watch over all of it. The night settled over the valley and the coyotes began their conversation with the stars, and the house held its quiet warmth against the cooling dark, and Cole Danver sat on his porch with his wife's hand in his, and let the years settle around him like something that had finally, fully, arrived. In the spring of 1890, They planted a garden along the front of the house. Clara's idea, but Cole built the fence for it. 3 rails of peeled wood that enclosed a strip of ground where Clara and Alina planted marigolds along the inside edge. Bright orange gold in the Arizona sun, growing with the same annual commitment that Mrs. Houghton's marigolds had always grown with, which was, Clara said when Cole pointed out the resemblance, entirely intentional. She was a woman who knew what she was doing, Clara said, patting the earth around a young plant with her bare hand. So are you, Cole said. She looked up at him from where she was crouched beside the garden bed, with dirt on her hands and her hair coming loose the way it had on the first night he saw her, in that sitting room in Redemption. And she smiled at him, not the small polite one or even the full unguarded one, but the one that existed only between them, the one that had taken years to build and was now simply always there, as permanent and as warm as the Arizona sun. Alina, 2 years old and convinced she was helping, patted the earth around a neighboring plant with enormous enthusiasm and approximately zero useful effect. Thomas, 6 and serious about everything, was placing the plants with a geometric precision that would have impressed a surveyor. Cole crouched down beside Clara and helped her firm the earth around the marigold, and their hands worked alongside each other in the red Arizona dirt with the ease of 2 people who have been doing things alongside each other long enough that they no longer have to think about the coordination. It simply happens, as natural as breathing, as natural as the way the light falls on the mountains every morning and the way the stars come out every night, as reliable and as good. The marigolds grew. The children grew. The ranch grew. The love between them, which had started with a locket in the red dust, and a sitting room and a burst of tears, and an offer of 2 days on the road that was not about 2 days on the road at all, grew in the way that the best things grow. Not by expanding into something larger than itself, but by deepening into something that takes up the same space in the world but goes further down than the roots of anything around it, all the way down to the bedrock, all the way down to the thing that does not change regardless of what the surface does, the thing that holds. And every morning, when the Arizona sun came up over the Sulphur Springs Valley, and the mountains caught the first light and the marigolds were still dark in the dawn, Cole Danver woke in his own house beside his wife, and the locket lay on the table where Clara set it each night and picked it up each morning, and the day began. And the world was exactly as large and as committed to surviving against its own nature as it had always been, and this was precisely enough.